Today we're going to be talking about barley, which is one of Scotland's dominant arable crops, where in 2019 just under 2 million tonnes were produced. The crop is typically used for malting, so the production of whisky, and also for animal feed. However, there is an increasing need to maintain and increase production, and it's critically important to address the challenges of producing more food with fewer inputs and also within a very unpredictable climate. The question is, how can the research community address these needs, and what are the main issues that industry stakeholders need for addressing these future needs? With funding from the SEFARI Gateway and the Scottish Society for Crop Research, stakeholders were invited from across the barley supply chain to discuss the challenges and understand more about current barley research. So I'd like to welcome three people from the research community who attended the meeting, and that's Doctors Joanne Russell, Tim George and Alison Carley, who all work at the James Hutton Institute. So Joanne, clearly there's a need to reduce the inputs and adapt to a changing climate, but what were the actual main messages that came from the meeting with the stakeholders?
Thanks, Ken. I think probably the key message, which was echoed across all of the groups, was that we need to communicate. And we need to communicate at all levels between government and policymakers, the consumers, the scientists, breeders, growers, the levy and advisory boards, and the maltsters and the distillers. Most of the people who attended this type of meeting have never ever sat in the same room together. So it was a really interesting mix of people, and it was actually really encouraging to sit in a room for 2 whole days and talk nothing but barley. Just to quote one of the group's findings, the key to future barley research is to develop a transdisciplinary scientific approach, in other words, Team Barley, bringing together researchers from a wide range of disciplines and organisations to work together with an equally trans-sectional stakeholder engagement. I mean, that sounds like a mouthful, but basically the key message was that we should all try and work together and work at different levels, and the only way to achieve this is by working together.
I think it's true to say that from the old TV adverts, it's good to talk. Clearly, it is good to talk with a number of different people on a number of different levels. And obviously for the future, it's going to be critical in reducing carbon consumption and adapting to variable climates, and highlights the need to be having these conversations. It's interesting that you mentioned policy and policy targets for agricultural sustainability and also reaching this net zero target. But what specifically are the traits that you're actually looking for in achieving these kind of like targets? So what are the priorities for barley quality traits?
I guess, well, probably a good example was if this is, we had Peter Nelson gave a talk on the very first talk of the meeting, and he's the distillery manager for the Glenmorangie company. And so you can imagine that's a large number of distilleries across the whole of Scotland and generates a large income. It was refreshing really to hear that his main emphasis was the sustainable production and sourcing of barley. They want to source barley locally, they want sustainable production. And if you think about where most of our distilleries are located, they're located in communities, in rural communities. So they really do have the heart of the community and the rural economy as one of their main targets and one of their main priorities. And he summed up by saying that we really need to strive scientifically to produce low energy, resilient, high quality barley that are climate resilient and sustainable. And that's quite a priority for a large company such as Glenmorangie.
Quality is the key, and it's what made whisky, it's almost the fingerprint of whisky globally. So what aspects of barley genetics is going to be important for delivering these quality characteristics of the barley itself?
Over the last few years, we've kind of renewed interest in our the wild relatives of our cereal crops. And we really feel strongly that the key to actually improving quality and sustainability is to actually look backwards. Barley started off in the Fertile Crescent about 10,000 years ago. To date, we have about 400,000 barley accessions that are housed globally in gene banks, and most of this is untapped variation, but they've been collected from across the wide range of ecogeographical areas in which barley has been adapted.
What about gene editing? Is the future in gene editing for harnessing these particular traits?
As you can imagine, our meeting there was a very diverse group of people at the meeting, and so there was very different opinions on gene editing and gene modification. But from our perspective, gene editing is a really invaluable and complementary tool to traditional types of crossing programs and breeding. What it does is it allows you actually to pinpoint specific genes and to look at how that gene interacts just on the single gene level.
Many thanks, Joanne. I'd now like to speak to Tim George. And it'd be interesting to hear what the actual main challenges were that the stakeholders within the industry felt in relation to the production of barley under this changing climate and this drive towards net zero.
Okay, yeah, thanks. The workshops came up with basically four main challenges that were identified by the groups, and specifically the first one that most people thought of was the need to reduce inputs. So things like fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and so on. So in order to achieve that net zero, we really need to reduce those inputs and improve the efficiency of the crop without those inputs. So how do we maintain yield and quality at the same time as achieving this net zero carbon goal? Secondly, there was challenges identified around breeding for unpredictable environments, so future climates. How to bring in resilience in the crops to inter and intra-seasonal variation. We've seen in the last few years very varied climatic conditions, from very dry a couple of years ago to very wet this later summer and so on. So being able to predict that and being able to cope with that is a really key trait which needs to be or key challenge which needs to be dealt with. Another challenge that was identified was breeding for resilience. So how do we measure resilience in the first place, and how can we therefore identify a trait that we can use to go ahead and breed for? Was a key challenge identified. And finally, one of the primary challenges discussed was that of new and emerging diseases. So there's a clear need to identify ways of dealing with novel diseases that are emerging in regions due to changes in climate. So all in all, the four main challenges were those: reduced inputs, breeding for resilience, breeding to cope with unpredictable environments, and also new and emerging diseases.
Soil is moving up the agenda on a number of different levels because of its importance in working towards net zero. From your perspective, is there anything in particular you'd like to mention about that from your area of research?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as the soil is concerned, it's really important that we prioritise a couple of things. One is that we maintain the soil quality that we've got, and so we have some excellent soils in Scotland as far as production is concerned, but we need to maintain those soils so that they can best produce and continue to produce into the future. At the same time, we also need to enhance the quality and productivity of the more marginal soils, which there are many of as well. And by increasing the use of the marginal soils, we take the pressure off the better soils and the quality land.
That's quite interesting then. So there are two approaches to this. So one is about adapting to the environment and the changing climate, and the other is to actually bring more land technically into work by being able to make sure that we're producing barley specifically efficiently on land that historically we might not necessarily have used for production purposes. So interesting to get an understanding about the wider context of environmental sustainability of farming itself and barley production. So maybe this is more of a question for you, Ali. What was discussed at the meetings, and how do you feel barley production fits in within the wider context of environmental sustainability?
So, as already has been hinted from the earlier discussion, there was definitely concerns raised amongst stakeholders about how to maintain crop yields and to future-proof barley production and farming more generally as the environment changes. And alongside that, with the increasing pressure to reduce input reliance, whether that's on fertilisers that come with a large carbon footprint or pesticides that are gradually being taken off the shelf. But also how to balance these environmental considerations with the economics of producing a good quality and profitable crop.
Okay, and were there any common themes about how these particular challenges could be tackled?
There were. So these challenges are significant, and the call that we're experiencing from society, from policy, really is requiring a dramatic shift in thinking to come up with solutions. This was highlighted really nicely in the talk by David Meekie of Soil Association Scotland. He called for transformative change in agriculture and outlined a 10-year roadmap for adopting an agroecological approach to farming. And this approach would mitigate against biodiversity losses, reduce pollution from agriculture, increase its sustainability, and improve the health of humans and their nutrition.
And it's quite radical, or maybe not so radical, but 10 years is a long period of time. Do we actually need to be tackling this issue over? Obviously, there are no short-term fixes to the problem, but what would be a feature, for example, of an agroecological approach that you mentioned that David spoke about?
So David outlined quite clearly there were sort of 6 main areas that he focused on, and these fell into the categories of improving crop agronomy, livestock management, and how we use agricultural land. So in relation to crop production, he proposed that we really need better management of soil fertility, and legumes have got to be part of the rotation. This at the same time would reduce our reliance on plant protein imports.
So these are all great ideas, but how can you actually implement such approach? Where does the drive need to come from to make these changes?
So some of the other aspects that David discussed really give you an idea of how this is a whole system approach, because he also highlighted the need to phase out our reliance on pesticides and recommended that for livestock farming we need to increase the area of permanent grassland, which improves soil quality at the same time. But although these approaches might sound radical compared to what we're doing at the moment in terms of current large-scale farming, in fact they are based on existing knowledge and historical practices. And I think earlier Joanne mentioned about looking back in time. Well, I think that's also true of how we manage the whole farming system. This was summarised really well by Caroline Drummond of the organisation LEAF UK, Linking Environment and Farming. She explained that to deliver sustainable farming that's fit for the future really requires new thinking built on traditional skills and expertise.
Earlier we heard from Joanne and Tim about the approaches they've taken from a very much a trait perspective and harnessing these natural features, which typically I imagine taking place in a nice sterile laboratory. With integrated approaches, is it a similar approach? Is it very much controlled environment, or is it larger than that?
So I think with looking at the success of different integrated farm management approaches and practices, it does require a larger scale approach and also long-term investment in research and in experimental platforms. And we heard, for example, talks at the event by Robin Walker at RUC, who described a long-term field experiment where they're testing optimal crop rotations to look at their effects on soil health and on barley production and quality. And that is kind of experimental work needs to be carried out over a long period of time. Another example is Kathy Hawes at the Hutton Institute. She described how long-term research at the Institute's Centre for Sustainable Cropping has shown how integrated management in a diverse crop rotation can reduce reliance on inputs and improve biodiversity while maintaining crop yields. Again, that's a long-term investment over many years of time.
There are clearly a number of different approaches for tackling this long-term problem. And it seems to me that there is a great deal of requirement for a number of different skills. Is that certainly something that you've seen more and more over the years?
I think this is summed up really nicely from one of the quotes from one of the stakeholders at the event, which was that the economics doesn't stack up for some of the solutions, and neither do the yields, and that we need a balance between new cropping systems, economics and yield. So I think what this quote arose from was the concern that a shift in agricultural practices away from what the system we currently have to more alternative approaches could lead to compromising farmers' profits and therefore livelihoods. So if we want transformational change in farming and in barley production, we really need structures and support to farmers and the value chains that rely on them. And that might include new ways of recognising environmental stewardship, for example, in relation to biodiversity targets, or policies to encourage more diverse crop types or cropping practices.
It's a fascinating area, certainly a fascinating topic, because there is always a misconception that newer is always better, but clearly newer isn't always better, certainly when you're looking at a changing climate, and we need something that's quite flexible in the environment in which it can grow, and that's obviously what everyone around this table that we've spoken about today is actually aiming to achieve.